By far the most popular and iconic map in the entirety of TF2 is CTF2 Fort. It's the most played map in casual, it's the most run map on community servers. In fact, it's so popular that it's been recreated in literally every single game that has a map creator. It's not a stretch to say that 2 Fort is TF2 distilled down to its core. I mean, the map is literally 2 team fortresses for God's sake. And this is all fascinating to me because as a map, 2 Fort sucks. It's got insane sniper sightlines, horribly tight corridors, sentry spots that cover literally every possible route to the objective, a single tiny flank route that's so long it's barely worth taking, massive bottlenecks, nonsensical room layouts. It is incredibly easy to spawn camp. It runs the worst game mode TF2 has to offer, and overall it is one of the most campy and slow-paced maps in the entire game. It's such an absolute slog to play if you're even remotely trying to win that most people who join just go friendly. But while I think the terrible nature of 2 Fort adds a lot to its charm, naturally that begs the interesting question for me. Can it be fixed? Is 2 Fort so fundamentally bad that no amount of tweaks short of replacing the entire map can make it playable? I feel like a lot of people would answer yes, citing the reason that Capture the Flag as a game mode is doomed to fail from the start. Compared to much better designed game modes like Payload or King of the Hill, you quickly hit a ceiling with how good a Capture the Flag map could actually be. But personally, I disagree. I think more modern maps like Landfall and Applejack prove that designing a good CTF map is entirely possible. And while yeah, the current design of 2 Fort is pretty bad, I actually think there's a lot here to work with. So with my recent venture into making TF2 maps, I thought it would be fun to take on the impossible, redesigning 2 Fort to be as playable as the CTF maps I actually enjoy. And after about a month of work, I think I did a pretty damn good job on it. So after a word from today's sponsor, I want to discuss how I turned 2 Fort from one of the campiest maps in TF2 to an actually fun CTF map. This video is sponsored by Raycon. Raycon is an audio hardware company that offers premium earbuds for prices that don't obliterate your bank account. They're fantastic everyday earbuds or comfy little doodads that fit snugly inside of your ear and have some neat stuff packed into them. For instance, multi-point connectivity, meaning if you have a laptop and phone, you can listen to audio on both at the same time without having to constantly reconnect them. They have 32 hours of battery life, meaning they will stay on for actual ages once you charge them, and even if you forget to, you can wirelessly get 90 minutes of battery for only 10 minutes of charging. My personal favorite feature though is the active noise canceling, which effectively dims out the ambient sound so you only hear what's playing through the earbuds. This is very handy, but normally it's a feature that's hard to find at a good price point. The Raycon everyday earbuds though start at only half the price of other premium audio brands. I also really like how much you can customize both the earbuds themselves and the case they come in. I got mine in blue and covered the case in this cool galaxy print skin, and I personally liked mine. Now that the weather's warmer, I tend to wear them when I'm walking around my neighborhood every day. The noise canceling goes a long way into filtering out the sounds of traffic, which would otherwise be annoying. If you want a pair of these yourself, you can go to buyraycon.com/greatblue to get 20% off site-wide, brought to you by Raycon. There's no risk to trying them either. If you decide you're not happy with them in the first 30 days, you can return them for absolutely free with no questions asked. They're definitely worth trying out. So first of all, I'll mention that going into everything, I had a couple self-imposed design principles that I tightly stuck to. After all, we're tampering with not only TF2's most popular map, but one of the most iconic maps in multiplayer gaming in general. So I wanted to set a couple guidelines for myself to make sure everything that I was implementing kept the feel of 2 Fort as it is. Because yeah, once everything's said and done, I do want the final product to still feel like 2 Fort as much as possible. So with those lines drawn in the sand, I began my very arduous journey of reworking 2 Fort. My strategy going into everything was to write down every problem I could possibly think of with vanilla 2 Fort, implement things that I hoped would fix those problems, and then see how all of those changes interact with one another, which ended up working pretty well since it allowed me to test a lot of things very quickly instead of having to go through them one by one. It does mean that discussion of changes is rather top heavy though, so bear with me for a little bit because there is a lot to cover in version 1. So considering I had to start somewhere, the very first change that I thought to make was to the spawn rooms. One thing about 2 Fort that's always bothered me is that this spawn room, the main one, is way more desirable of a spawn location than this one, the secondary spawn. The main spawn room exits into the middle of your upstairs, meaning you have immediate access to the courtyard by going right, the battlements by going left, an ambush on the downstairs choke point by going forward into the great room, and even the spiral should the flankers be trying to take the intel through it. This covers every possible option that you'd realistically want to take upon respawning. Overall, a very solid spawn location. On the other hand, the secondary spawn room only has 2 routes out, and they're both objectively worse versions of what you get with the main one. You have an exit that puts you directly on the battlements, and an exit that drops you in an awkward position in the downstairs in this hallway. Why these positions suck is that the battlements exit is incredibly easy to camp because of the shutter, and the drop-down gives you no viewing angle to camp from above like the Great Room does. The literal only benefits to spawning here are if you want to snipe from a less predictable angle, or if the main spawn is getting camped. That's it. Outside of those incredibly niche situations, it's inferior in every way. In fact, whenever I spawn here, I find myself mashing my loadout preset binds to burn through the spawn locations and get back to the main one. It's such an arbitrary and needless disadvantage to be put at through no fault of your own, and I can't help but wonder why the spawns are balanced this poorly. So how did I fix the second spawn? Well, it's simple. I removed it. This is the spawn now. now. No more key mashing to get closer to the courtyard when the enemy team's pushing your intel. Now, I say this is a simple fix, but this does introduce a major problem of its own that would need to be ironed out before all is well. Camping the main spawn is incredibly easy as a lot of classes, and now you don't have any other spawn options in the event that it is. But thankfully, that's a much easier fix than trying to balance two separate spawns and was solved by two very basic changes. First, I added a second side exit that leads out into the courtyard, and second, I replaced the default opaque doors with these alternative doors that have one-way windows in them. That way, if you see a cheeky demo is planning on nuking you the second you leave one door, you can just use the other one. And as it turns out, yeah, these basic changes solve the spawn situation perfectly. Even upon first impression, most people ended up really liking these changes. But not only for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, because on top of fixing the spawn inequality problem, it also accidentally solved the other issue of teams tending to swarm all over their base. With two spawns, you never really know which way enemies are going to come from when you're attacking. You can very easily be flanked from the battlements when you're trying to get through the downstairs bottleneck, which is something that I noticed made the map a lot more campy overall. So yeah, overall fixing the spawns was a very positive change to make. Oh, and for those wondering, this is what the second spawn looks like now. I wasn't sure what to do with the battlements in this version, so I just left it as a dead end with health and ammo packs with the intent of spicing it up later. Next up is the courtyard, which was slightly redesigned with the intent to accommodate the new spawn changes. The main addition is this new path on the side of the courtyard that aligns with the second spawn exit. Now, aside from the fact that it looks fine visually, avid 2 Fort players may notice a problem with this being here. This effectively hands the courtyard to the defending team for practically free, since on top of being a fantastic sentry spot on its own means that a lot more people will be constantly pouring out a spawn here. Which, yeah, was certainly a concern at first, but after thinking about it a little bit more, I realized that honestly, that's something I'm completely fine with. I think it's fine to have certain areas of the map be inherently easier to hold by the defending team, especially if those areas are right outside of your own spawn and the enemy team doesn't have to push through them to get to the objective. Of course, the problem with normal 2 Fort is that, yeah, you absolutely do have to push through the courtyard to get to the objective, but that's a much more fixable problem that I'm willing to endure if it means sorting out the spawn situation for good. Other than that, though, the only other adjustment that I made to the courtyard was flipping these stairs to allow attackers to expose themselves less when pushing in. This didn't end up making a huge difference, but I definitely noticed it when certain sentry spots were being used, so I'd say it was overall a positive change. And yeah, despite some people's reservations, these changes all ended up working perfectly fine and were all untouched through the rest of the versions. Okay, so in order for you to understand my thought process on the next few changes, we first need to look at what I've done to the downstairs. The main issue with the downstairs in vanilla is that it is cramped. This is a choke point, this is a choke point, this entire hallway is a giga choke point, and every route you can possibly take leads you to the courtyard, which, you guessed it, is also a choke point. And the only routes to bypass the downstairs both require some form of vertical mobility, meaning that medic pockets can't follow you in, so pushing is a lot harder that way. So not only could the downstairs use some more open space, but it desperately needs more routes that bypass the bottlenecks. For the right side of the downstairs, I just took the path of least resistance and made this previously cosmetic door work as a complete route. So now instead of there only being 2 entrances into the downstairs base, there are now 3. In all honesty, this was a change that I mainly made because it was easy to do considering the geometry was already there. And while people were a bit mixed on this one at first, overall I think it did benefit the map, even if how it benefited the map changed a bit from version to version. The much bigger and more ambitious change to the downstairs, though, is this. A brand new area near the left entrance that not only has a doorway that connects to the upstairs sewer room, but also a staircase that leads up to this previously super campy grate area. No more flank routes that are restricted to rocket jumping. Now any class can get up here for free, making it a necessary area to defend. This is why I was a lot more comfortable making the courtyard easier to defend. There's now a second complete and much more convenient route to the intel that doesn't require you to walk right past enemy spawn. And on top of that, it makes the grate area actually serve a real purpose instead of just being a weird afterthought that makes the choke point situation even worse. And ultimately, doubling the ways you can get to the objective was massive and easily one of the most impactful changes to improve the map. And yes, as you may have noticed, the room right outside of the spiral was also expanded a bit to give attackers more options when pushing. The other thing that keen-eyed viewers may have noticed earlier is that the sewer room seems a little out of place. And that is because, yes, I moved the entire sewer room to be flush with this wall instead of having the weird hallway in the middle. This mostly coincides with my changes to the sewer, which I'll get to later, but I really did like the options it provided when traversing the downstairs. So that solved the option of the intel room being too hard to get to, right? You now have an alternate route upstairs which gives you easy access to, Oh. Yeah, so we should probably address the abomination known as the spiral. I have had people sit here and try to gaslight me into thinking it's iconic or whatever, but the spiral just sucks. It is one of the longest and most cramped areas I can think of in the entire game, even beating out the turbine vents when you consider there are 0 branching paths. One soldier, demo, pyro, heavy, engineer, or sniper completely locks down the entire thing with pretty minimal counterplay. So if even one person on the enemy team as much as remembers the spiral exists, it is practically a no-go zone. And what's even funnier is that trying to to take the intel out through the spiral is practically a death sentence. If you're in your base and an enemy tries it, all you have to do is watch the little arrow wiggle around for like 20 straight seconds before blowing the scout the kingdom come. I genuinely cannot fathom what they were thinking by designing it like this in the first place, which ultimately led me to the pretty easy decision that the spiral had to go. It just did. There is no way to make this enticing to push into. So the spiral is now gone, but before you yell at me, let me show you what I replaced it with. This is the new spiral, or as people referred to it as the stairwell. It's identical to the spiral in purpose, but on top of being a lot shorter and more open, it is way more interesting with how it uses verticality. Instead of being a long straight hallway in which any class can defend for completely free, you now have to put some consideration into how you're fighting in there. It also has this drop down at the cost of a bit of your health if you need to get to the intel room quickly, which you can now refill by the new packs on the landing. And overall, I think out of every change that I made to 2 Fort, this is one that I'm the most proud of. I tried as hard as I possibly could to replicate the aesthetics of the spiral here. I even went as far as to keep this demonic bit of geometry on the ceiling to give it a more rounded look, even though this was pain to work with. But overall, I can confidently say that my efforts paid off, because this was easily the change that people liked the most. In combination with the new staircase into the Great Room, it allowed for a much more balanced attack route than what you'd get in vanilla, which really helped the games flow smoothly. And considering the new downstairs door, it's not like the Courtyard route got obsoleted either. Rather, it turned into the faster but much higher risk of the two routes. You can get from mid to straight very quickly by going through the door, but there's going to be a lot of defenders in your way. So yeah, overall splitting the attacking route into a long but safe and short but dangerous one was a very good change to make to 2 Fort in my opinion. And while again, it wasn't perfect and there were certainly improvements to be made, this made it leagues better to play than normal 2 Fort. One thing that the route split didn't solve is where those routes converge, which is the intel room. The intel room was pretty high on my shit list for changes, being notorious among TF2 maps as one of the hardest areas in the game to push into. You've got a small room with big corners that can only be entered through 2 incredibly cramped hallways. This inevitably leads to engineer hell on every single 2 Fort map in the entirety of TF2, which is why I was very surprised that 2 very basic changes almost completely solved every single problem. The first is widening this entrance a ton to give a lot more visibility of the closer corners. Part of the problem now is that you have practically zero flexibility in how you can peek sentries, so this should give you a lot more options when pushing in. And the second change was to move the server rack a bit to allow you to freely attack sentries in the back corners without them being able to fight back. And that's it. That almost completely solved the problem of sentries in the inner room being impossible to kill. There were still a couple spots that covered both routes pretty well, but that is leagues better than having sentries in every single corner that protect one another. I also, of course, removed the downstairs spawn, which was unfortunately a much more controversial change than I expected. Aside from benefiting engineers extremely well, the biggest problem with it is that it had a one-way door with infinite free health and ammo on the other side. Every single time I push the intel room and there's a soldier or demo there defending, they just pop into the intel room and peek out to kill me. It is the most unfun interaction ever, and the only people that were sad about me reverting it are the people who like to abuse it. But overall, these changes did a lot to help the intel room situation and made it a genuinely interesting battleground. Generally, what would happen is that attackers would push in from the stairwell side and defenders would push in from the courtyard side, which led to a lot fewer annoying interactions on stairs, which is nice to see. As with every other change that I've discussed so far, the intel room wasn't perfect because there were still a few strategies that people found to make it a chore to break into, but it easily took it down from a 9 out of 10 difficulty to push to like a 5 out of 10, which is a massive improvement. So now we've reached the final changes that I've made to 2 Fort, which were to mid, and oh boy, these are going to be quite the jump scare if you've not seen it yet. So here's normal 2 Fort mid. And then here's my take on a better 2 Fort mid. Oh my god, Great Blue removed the bridge, kill him with hammers. Before you yell at me too much, let me explain why I did this. Something I'd done a lot before working on 2 Fort is analyzing what makes the good capture the flag maps actually work. Clearly there's gotta be something separating the fun maps like Applejack and Landfall from the hell that's 2 Fort and Turbine, so my question is what exactly that was. And one of the patterns that I found is that mid on the fun maps is an actually enjoyable place to fight in. In fact, vanilla 2 Fort probably without exaggeration has the worst mid out of any map in the entire game. By far the biggest problem with it is that the entire thing is sniper hell, of which the only way to bypass is through this singular cramped bridge. Way too many of your lives consist of you instantly getting domed the split second you peek in the mid or just cowering and not even doing it in the first place, which just has to go. I don't care if it's part of 2 Fort's identity or whatever, it makes the map unplayable for everyone who isn't a sniper main. So yeah, sorry sniper mains, but you have had it too good for too long. That is getting fixed without hesitation. The biggest problem that I ran into trying to block sniper sightlines though is that the default 2 Fort bridge model is sloped parallel to the battlements, and because the best sniper spots are on the sides of each battlement, I'd have to make it comically large to block anything at all. So the easiest solution that I could come up with to not only widen the bridge a bit, but also to block the sightlines was to create a brand new building entirely. And ultimately, this is what I came up with. It's partially inspired by Applejack's mid building and partially by Wells, both maps that people generally like the feel of. And considering the circumstances, I'd say that I came up with a pretty good solution. Again, I did as much as I possibly could to keep the feel of the original bridge, although there's only so much you can do while also making it check every box that it needs to. And in case you're still not convinced that's a good idea, know that nearly all of the playtesters love this change. I know it's weird and different and scary, but you cannot argue with results. So even if you're someone that lives and dies by every single part of 2 Fort being iconic or whatever, take solace in the fact that you're not going to instantly die when one of your head pixels enters the battlements. That was not the only change that I made to mid though. It solves the most important problem but leaves like 20 others. The first of which is that vanilla mid is microscopic when considering how much room you realistically want for a team fight. So I started by expanding mid horizontally a bit and adding these standing areas that jut out from either side, which was good at creating room and connecting to the downstairs entrance, but it still left the problem that you're forced to cross the bridge to get to the other side. So I decided to add smaller bridges to the sides of mid to give alternative options that have less cover but are generally more out of danger. From these bridges, I added stairs that go down into the water, that way you can actually climb back out should you fall in, as well as adding these fences nearby to prevent snipers from having free reign to the entire map. The bridges worked, I suppose, though you could definitely feel they needed improvement for the reasons that I'll discuss in V2. And just for fun, I made the area under the bridge a little pyro shark spot with some health packs similar to what Kong King has. This definitely comes closer to the category of unnecessary change for the hell of it than what I've done in this version so far, but the alternative was to leave the entire pool completely empty, which looks fine in vanilla, but considering the added size just does not look right here. So I might as well pick the lesser of evils and make it interesting, playing into what people already like about it. Which at the end of the day didn't make much difference. I think the only real use that it got was as a cheeky teleporter spot because most people didn't go down there unless they needed health. Which, oh yeah, there actually is one more area of 2 Fort. If you were paying any amount of attention earlier, you probably noticed that the sewer entrances aren't where they're supposed to be. In vanilla 2 Fort, the sewers are very functional, sure, but they are lame as hell. It does have the benefit of being able to get from one base to the other without ever being exposed to mid, but it takes so long to get from one end to the other, and you're still just running through a cramped hallway the entire time. And it's not like you're free from sniper purgatory either, because they still have 2 really good angles that can shut down the sewers entirely. So ultimately that leaves them in a very awkward position, since with mid being a lot more playable, we no longer have the problem they exist to solve. But I didn't just want to remove them either, so I retooled them into a niche but functional flank route that's accessible directly from mid. The main way that I did this while also nerfing the sniper sight line was shortening the tunnels in literally any way that I could, which, if you recall earlier, also meant moving the sewer stair room a bit closer to the rest of the downstairs, which was definitely a good change to make, because while the sewers aren't always useful, they can definitely be a clutch way to enter a heavily populated mid or enemy base undetected. And because the little server room down there is untouched, it still makes for a fantastic teleporter spot should you want to flank. The reason I moved the entrances to the sides instead of directly under the bridge is because I wanted there to be more interaction with the people using the sewers. In vanilla, you literally never see the people using the sewers unless you're also in the sewers yourself, which does make them very safe, but as I mentioned, we don't really need the safety that provides anymore. So offsetting them horizontally was more of a placeholder change that worked way better than expected, and I never really felt the need to adjust it further. And with all of that, version 1 of CTF Blue Fort was complete. I know it's a lot at once, so thanks for sticking with me. With these changes implemented, I did a big playtesting stream with viewers and left the server up for anyone to play for a few days. After each stream that I did, I put up a poll for anyone that played, which garnered a fair amount of feedback that was used to improve the later versions. As for version 1, people seemed to enjoy the map overall, and the general consensus is that it was undoubtedly an improvement to stock 2 Fort. But there were still some challenges that had yet to be overcome, so my work was still cut out for me. The biggest of which is that despite my best efforts, the routes to the intel still felt very restrictive. Each individual component was certainly an improvement, and the stairwell was infinitely better than the spiral, don't get me wrong. But overall, it was just still too long, and it still had the problem of forcing attackers through multiple small doorways to get both into and out of the intel room. And as expected, the courtyard route was still doable, but it was a lot harder to push than vanilla due to its closeness to spawn. So it became obvious to me that what the map desperately needed was a much faster route to the intel. So in response, I made a very controversial change to the map just to see what would happen. And that was adding a doorway right here, which leads directly from the downstairs part of the base to the landing at the stairwell. This made it very easy to get to the intel room, since now you could do it entirely out of sight of the enemy spawn. And what's more, this cut down the total time required to cap from 48 seconds to about 40 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but that's nearly a 20% decrease. I won't lie, people really did not like this change when I first showed it to them, and I don't know if I can blame them for protesting it. At first glance, it does look like it'd make blitzing the intel nearly impossible to stop, but in practice, I found that this opening helped the flow of the rounds tremendously. Having to walk by enemy spawn is such a massive issue in stock 2 Fort, and while I did try to improve it in V1, it just didn't do enough. So allowing you to completely bypass that problem entirely made it a lot easier to attack, and frankly a lot more interesting to defend as well. It was actually possible to coordinate a push directly into the intel room itself rather than first having to go up and down the stairs. This meant that instead of having to burn stuff like banners and Uber just to get past enemy spawn, you could save it directly for the intel. And while it did make the upstairs route less necessary overall, it was still a really good counter to the best defensive strategies. For instance, a sentry spot right here on the top of the stairwell did a lot to repel people pushing through the new door. But if that spot was in use, you could easily have a second teammate push up into the great room and splash it from around the corner. And additionally, even though it wasn't directly in view of enemy spawn, you still had to contend with the waves of people coming out of spawn. So having teammates in the great room to push them back while you push the intel ended up being a very effective strategy overall. So while sure, this new doorway was a change that most people would look at and probably not be too fond of, it was 100% necessary to fix the map. It created a lot of nuance in the way pushes are both done and dealt with rather than just being a bottleneck simulator, and I'm very glad I stuck to my guns and committed to it. The second biggest problem version 1 had was snipers. Still, yes, they are really that annoying to design maps around. Admittedly, most of the new mid was pretty bad for sniper, but the spot that got abused the most was right here on the side bridge. This not only gives you view of the entirety of mid, but also lets you see up into the opponent's battlements, which is an even better angle than what you get in vanilla. So in thinking of ways to block sight lines, that gave me the idea to bring back a classic 2-fort asset. To my surprise, the bridge isn't just a single model, it's actually made up of 3 separate ones. The supports and the railing don't do much for me here, but the cover portion fits perfectly on the side bridges. So with a bit of creative brushwork to make it fit the environment more, this was a perfect solution. I definitely think this was the spice that mid needed, because on top of looking super cool, it created a much more interesting vertical battleground. It was a ton of fun to have a lot more jumping area as scout and soldier, but due to the abundance of cover, it wasn't very annoying for the less mobile classes to fight against either. Unfortunately, just the cover still leaves the sightline problem untouched, but for that I have my secret weapon, chicken wire. Chicken wire is probably the most transparent texture in TF2 that can't actually be shot through, which ends up being an absolutely perfect material to cover the entirety of mid with, because it still allows you to see the people in the buildings but not shoot them through it. And just for good measure, as well as because mid was a lot more barren than I'd like, I added a lot more props around mid too. This cleanly fixed the sniper issue incredibly well, and for the rest of the playtest, he was still decent but not incredibly dominant. Hooray. Overall, these changes made mid feel a lot more complete and fun to fight in, which again, considering my goals for the map, was very nice to see. The third change is another one that's also a bit controversial, but as with the previous few, it was very necessary based on how the rounds tended to play. On each of the battlements, I added a one-way door that can only be opened from the inside. This was meant to solve 2 separate issues. First, the lack of a second spawn meant that soldiers and demos could continuously farm some pretty cheesy kills by jumping onto the battlements and spawn camping. But second, I noticed a lot of people would camp on their battlements instead of properly fighting at mid, just ducking back into their spawn to heal whenever they took a bit of damage. Which ultimately, while it was a good strategy, in the spirit of encouraging team fights at mid, it wasn't something that I wanted. So by having the one-way door, you're now committing a lot more to fighting at mid by going out into the battlements. Reception to this was mostly positive, but some people disliked that you now had to have a teammate let you back in if you were trying to retreat. Which sure, was a bit annoying, but it was a pretty funny aspect of team coordination that I think gets underlooked on a lot of maps that use one-way doors. The final major change in V2 was following up on something that I did in V1, and that is making the other side of the battlements more interesting than just a dead end. The dead end, while technically functional, was not intended to be the final state of the battlements. The main issue, though, is that I wanted every change that I make to solve a specific problem, and there really weren't that many problems with the battlements at this point. The only small one that even kinda needed solving is that now that there's a one-way door, rocket jumping up to the battlements is completely pointless. So to both answer that problem and make the battlements a bit more visually interesting, I extended it to the back wall and made it open to the downstairs. This was definitely an experimental change because I honestly was not too sure what it would end up doing, but as it turns out, this ended up being a really cool solution to the balcony that most people liked. There were concerns of this creating a potentially powerful sentry spot, but considering how easy those sentries are to flank by rocket jumpers, this was rarely a problem. The coolest thing this change added, though, is this strafe jump. It's slightly too long for engineers and snipers to use, but barely doable by spy, which effectively created a spy-only flank route that lets him get behind the people on the battlements, which is honestly way too cool of a change for it being entirely accidental, but I will certainly take it. Other than that, though, it was a very welcome visual change and made the room a lot more interesting, which is perfectly fine with me. There were also a couple of minor changes in this version that were added to solve more niche problems. First was adding this batch of props in the upstairs base, which both gave cover for the people coming out of spawn and blocked off this sentry spot. Even in my fixed version of 2-fort being hyper aware of sentry spots, I forgot to account that a sentry right here covers every possible route. Oops. I also replaced this walkway with a grate to give more information to the people entering from below. In vanilla, this one walkway is the single biggest problem to pushing into the courtyard because you cannot see anything. So just to make the courtyard a little bit easier to push in a much more fair way, I figured this was a necessary change to make. And also, yes, for those that are fans of my channel, this is a material that allows explosions to pass through, so sitting on this pathway is no longer completely risk-free. I also decided to remove the barriers here to allow this little cubby to exist in the hallway so it isn't as cramped. This was mainly done because of how important I expected this hallway to be with the existence of the new door, and I didn't want fights in here to be too annoying if I could help it. And finally, I did some minor restructuring, like opening up the second hallway to the intel a bit more, which was pretty nice, and lengthening the bend in the sewers to make it a lot less awkward looking. And largely, that is the extent of the changes that I made in version 2. And to my shock and surprise, these changes left the map in a way better state than I expected for only 2 playtests. In fact, at the end of the testing session for V2, I had so little that I wanted to change that I did a second one on the same version just to make sure I wasn't stupid and overlooking something obvious. It played super well, giving ample opportunities to control mid, good routes to push through, and fair ways to defend against those pushes. It had a lot more interesting terrain for combat, and it was overall surprisingly balanced. It could get a little bit campy at times, but I found that it got campy in very interesting ways. Unlike vanilla 2 Fort, where defense is done mostly passively by the people respawning, you actually had to dedicate some manpower to make sure your intel wasn't constantly getting pushed. But considering how important holding mid was for the final outcome of the game, stacking engineers in the intel room very often led to a slow demise. After all, every engineer nested up in the intel room is one teammate not helping your team reclaim mid. So sure, as with any other map in TF2, stacking engineers did slow down the game a lot, but defense spam was actually a losing strategy now. And with the exceptions of the extreme cases like half the team playing Wrangler engineer, which yes, did in fact happen, I found the majority of matches flowed incredibly well. Nearly every round that I played was super close and tense, with the final score being 2-2 and both intels being taken out of their base. It's probably some of the most fun I've ever had actually trying to do the objective on a capture the flag map. There were certainly some changes that needed to be made going forward, so it'd be hard for me to call this version completely finished. But it was the first version that I would genuinely call a fun map, and it really only got better from here. So with how good version 2 was in terms of gameplay, I decided to shift my focus onto something else very important for version 3, the aesthetics. It's not something I've talked about much up until now, but one thing that was very important to me when making my revisions to 2 Fort is that I wanted to keep its visual identity completely intact, which typically wasn't too hard because it just meant reusing existing assets to make the environment more cohesive, but sometimes it did require me to get a little bit creative with how I solved certain problems. For instance, take the cover that I added outside of spawn. A triangular block of concrete would function perfectly fine here for all intents and purposes, but obviously that would look like a very lazy solution. It's not that it would be a hard stretch to say that concrete exists in the environment, but why would someone make a perfectly triangular block of concrete for makeshift cover? So to make it look a lot more cobbled together looking, I decided to make it a piece of sheet metal resting on some hay bales. It achieves the exact same function, but obviously looks a lot better for the room. But there's also a very unique problem for doing it this way, because while it looks fine on the red team's base, blue doesn't really have hay bales anywhere since their base is a lot more industrial. So for them, I had to find an industrial looking prop of a similar shape and size, which I decided on these crates for. This made the two upstairs rooms ever so slightly asymmetrical, which is something you probably didn't notice up until now, but will never stop noticing now that I told you. Which may sound like it'd cause some problems, but Vanilla 2 Fort actually does this exact thing a ton, and even in ways that affect gameplay a lot more directly than this. But this attention to detail is something that's very important to me, because ultimately it's something that the 2 Fort designers did incredibly well that I certainly don't want to ruin. And honestly, as long as it doesn't give a single team an obvious advantage, I really don't mind minor asymmetry like this. I think it makes maps a lot more interesting. As far as this affects version 3 of Blue Fort, well, it really doesn't. I just didn't have anywhere else to talk about it. But it does relate to the thing that I spent the most time on, which is a very specific bit of detailing that was missing from the first two versions. If you play a lot of stock 2 Fort, you may have noticed that something seemed ever so slightly off about the environment. And if you're a real 2 Fort enthusiast, you may have even picked up on a few specific instances of missing detail. As a result of imperfections caused by decompiling the map, the version of 2 Fort that I started editing had all of its overlays removed. An overlay is basically an image texture you can put directly onto an existing surface. Most of TF2's overlays are stuff like signs, team logos, arrows, random bits of grime, all stuff you'd naturally find on a wall. They're not much on their own, but by comparing what the game looks like with and without them, you can definitely see how much subtle detail they add. So because they were missing and I really didn't want them to be, most of version 3 was me painstakingly re-adding these things to the map. Now, despite just being detailing, it's not entirely cosmetic. Overlays do serve a very important purpose on the map that you may have never paid attention to, and that is highlighting the location of health and ammo packs even if they're currently on cooldown. For instance, even if I know nothing about the map that I'm playing on, I can walk up to this wall and immediately know that I'll get health and ammo if I wait for long enough. And similarly, even if I know the rough location of health packs, it helps me know exactly where to stand if I'm burning to death and need healed immediately. Again, this wasn't a major change in terms of how long it took me to implement, but it does go a long way into helping the map feel more intuitive for first-time players. The other major visual change that I made in this version was replacing this doorway with a broken wall. As a few viewers had pointed out, a proper doorway here would be a massive security flaw in an actual base like this, and really wouldn't make much sense to be here intentionally. So having it look like it was forcibly entered or just part of the base falling apart makes a lot more sense contextually. Again, it's a very minor thing, and I'm sure I'll get some jokes about nitpicking, but cohesive visual design is honestly a very fun thing to consider this closely. As far as the actual gameplay changes go for V3, there was really only one big one with a couple of minor ones. The big one was redoing this area outside of the broken wall, because as it stood, it was very claustrophobic. I figured turning it from a hallway into more of a room would make it play a lot better, because at least then you'd have a little bit of room to dodge explosive spam. I also decided to shift the doorway in the sewer room so it faced the broken wall instead of the rest of the downstairs. This made it a bit harder to defend, since now attacking attackers could come from 2 different directions instead of being funneled through the same hallway. It also shut down the nasty sentry in the hallway strategy, which was one of the most annoying things about the new route. For the smaller changes, I added a window near the one-way door, since apparently demos could just sticky camp from the corner completely out of sight. Funnily enough, the main benefit this had was as a nice teleporter exit spot to completely cheese the one-way door. Like I said, leaving the door one way created some very interesting opportunities for team play. I also added a bit more peeking room at the bottom of the stairwell leading into the intel room, since a single wrangled sentry was a nightmare to deal with otherwise. And I did something a little bit riskier in decreasing the base respawn time from 10 seconds to 7 seconds. This was mainly done just to see what would happen, and I hoped it would be a slight convenience to the people playing and not much else. Unfortunately, it made it way too hard to cap because the amount of people you had to contend with coming out of spawn increased significantly and was promptly reverted in version 4. So yeah, overall version 3 just improved on everything that worked in version 2 without having any wheels to reinvent. And had it not been for the lower respawn times making pushing really annoying, this easily would have been the most fun version. So that brings our journey to an end at version 4 and the final version, which for all intents and purposes were completely identical minus some visual fixes. Between these 2 versions, there were really only a couple minor gameplay tweaks to help curb certain annoying strategies. The first was replacing these concrete pipes in mid with a variety of taller cover. This was mainly done because it's really annoying you can't actually shoot through them, even though it totally looks like you can. But they were also abused by scouts as a very easy way to get on top of mid without having to run any movement items, which did become frustrating to fight after a while. And change 2 was unfortunate but entirely necessary to make, and that was putting a no-build zone on the roof of the mid building. I'd not mentioned it up until now, but building a sentry on the roof was a very prominent strategy people used to control mid. And in theory, it's a pretty cool way to play around the map, so I really did not want to remove it if I could help it. But even though a single engineer on the roof wasn't the hardest thing ever to take care of, the speed at which you could get back up there by jumping from your battlements was just way too fast to be fair. Even after getting his nest completely wiped, an engineer could jump back up there and rebuild his nest in under a minute, which really just was not fun to fight long term. Combine that with the fact that there never was just a single engineer, usually there would be at least one more, and also demos, soldiers, snipers, and pyros up there shooting at you too, and it was just too obnoxious to continually deal with and made retaking mid a lot harder than it deserved to be. So alongside the bug fix of people being able to pixel walk on certain ledges in mid, as well as a few visual touch-ups in various parts of the map, that was it. CTF Blue Fort is, for all intents and purposes, done. And overall, I have to say that I am very satisfied with how it turned out. Especially compared to stock 2 Fort, the rounds play incredibly well, with defending and attacking both being fun roles to play assuming the teams are balanced. And even if one team was clearly better, the map turned into more of a pushing simulator like Powerhouse, which in my opinion is a pretty fun design for it. The phrase I've thrown around a lot throughout the video is, "It's not perfect," which even after being done with the project is definitely still a sentiment that I stick to. If I had more time, I can think of a few areas like the sewers that could be fleshed out a bit more, as well as having some ideas for experimental route overhauls that I definitely want to try to test. But for what it is, I'm very happy with it, and it's taught me a lot about making completely normal TF2 maps that I'll definitely take with me into my future projects. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Occasionally I'd run into really annoying bugs that were basically impossible to test solo and have to make an emergency fix for them. For instance, when I opened the hallway that leads to the battlements, everything looked perfectly fine from the perspectives I alone was able to see while testing it. However, apparently the door below would clip into the hallway when open, which is something that I learned after the map was already uploaded to the server for live testing. Similarly, on the first version of the map, I forgot to make the cube maps for HDR settings. And because neither me nor the friend that I had test it play with high dynamic range turned on, we didn't notice anything was wrong. But apparently a lot more people than I thought do actually use HDR and played the entire first play test with the map looking like this. So yeah, this map was definitely a learning experience in about every single version that I uploaded. But it was a super fun exercise in both problem solving and design, and overall I'm very glad that I did it. So the last thing that I did with the map is a sort of contest between me and another creator. Both myself and Shonik wanted to do the same project side by side, where we recreated the same map in our own unique ways. And then to make it more interesting, we held our final play test in a joint stream and had our viewers vote on which one they liked better. It wasn't a very serious competition, it was more just to motivate us so we'd try our hardest to make the maps actually fun. After we left the maps up for a week to accumulate votes, mine ended up winning by a fair bit over Shonik's map. While I will no doubt hold that fact over his head for years to come, he made a really cool map too, so I'd encourage you to check out the video he made on his. We have very different design philosophies for maps, so it's cool to see how different our final results were despite the same starting point. But anyway, that's my redesign of 2 Fort that I've named CTF Blue Fort because it's funny. If you want to play the map yourself, I'll be running a 24/7 server that anyone can join and play. Link for that is in the description. And also thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring the video. It allows me to do fun but time-consuming projects like this on a more regular basis. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like. If you hated this video, I'd like to see you spend a month editing 2 Fort and see where your sanity ends up after that much time in Hammer. And most importantly, have a good one.